I'm Austinlugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about the 1992 movie Candyman.
So this week, it was neither of us, I suppose neither of us had seen the movie, but we kind of talked about what we were going to watch. And with the new Candyman coming out, I kind of wanted to watch the original because I had a lot of interest in the new one. I'd heard a lot about the original, but I'd never really seen it. I'd heard of it. I'd seen scenes from it, but I don't know. I'd wanted to see it. So how would you describe the original Candyman, Andrew?
It's a 90s gothic super horror film about a supernatural ghost figure called Candyman who has a difficult history, and therefore he kills because of what happened to him. Pretty, basic slasher ghost story fare in terms of there's a ghost and it's going around and it's killing people and it's a slasher thing. And yeah, no, I've heard about it for a while too, so it's cool to watch it. Based on Barker short story. Have you watched any Clive Barker movies at all?
Mm-mm. I don't think so.
Like Clive Barker, he's a British novelist and writer, and he's also a director and screenwriter. And he directed one of my favorite horror films, wrote and directed Hellraiser, which is now a big series and stuff. There's fucking 10 movies. But the first two are really, really good, especially the first movie. And there are a lot of similarities between Hellraiser and Candyman. Hellraiser is more a kind of a psychosexual thing, but Candyman also has that too a little bit. But Hellraiser is a little bit more usual fare because it's in a suburb and it's at this house and it's a teenage girl is kind of our main character and she's running around and stuff. But Hellraiser is a great movie, and I like Clive Barker, and I think he's an interesting writer. But I know he didn't do the script for this though. It was Bernard Rose who directed it, of course.
I also I should point out now that in preparation for this, I did watch both Candymans. So I saw the original, and then 2 days later I went to the theater and saw the second it's not really a remake. It's more of a continuation of the original Candyman. And I might talk about it a bit. I'll try not to spoil the new Candyman, at least not for you, Andrew.
I'll probably watch it this week.
It's good. There's some interesting deviations from the original that I don't know if I agree with. I think visually the new one is more, I guess, just because, I don't know, probably just because of a bigger budget. But I think some of the ideas from the original are kind of lost or transformed in ways that I don't know if they work or not, but I'll get into that later. So we open up on the sound of bees, buzzing, bees just buzzing around. And the very first shot is correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it's been a week since I've seen this movie now, but the opening scene is the bees, right? It's just a bunch of bees.
No, it's the city. It's the city of Chicago overhead as it's going across the cityscape.
When does the bee scene happen?
Which bees are you talking about, and when?
Where it's just a bunch of bees.
I don't know. When she opens the toilet, there's a bunch of bees, but that's later in the movie.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what I'm thinking of.
The movie opens up overhead bird's eye view, a shot of the city of Chicago. It's a very, very Chicago-y movie. You get hit with the Philip Glass score, which is great. Big fan of Philip Glass, and it's pulsating, minimalism, classical music, very good. Yeah, and it's just going over the city of Chicago, and then you're introduced, of course, to Helen, who is studying at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's researching urban legends. And we learn the very beginning scene is when a student is talking to her about a story that she knew about someone who was killed by Candyman, which is established that if you look in the mirror and you see Candyman 5 times, he'll appear and he'll murder you. The student tells her a story about how it happened, and Helen's like, oh, okay. And she's kind of researching it. He's got a big hook and a bloody stump thing that was disgusting. Hook. We don't really see him until later. They, of course, build him up a lot. But yeah, she's studying this, and she's a scientist or whatever, so she's whatever, it's all whatever. She's inspired to take it on because she learned about a woman who was murdered in a suburban home while babysitting. And then she's just kind of, she's a meticulous woman, Helen, and I think she's just trying to learn more about the Candyman, and she does a couple of different things. I think at one point too, those two cleaning ladies, they come and they talk to her about it. And yeah, she's just kind of like right now at this point in the movie, she's collecting more information. We also learn about her husband as well in the beginning, a little bit.
Yeah, and we meet Bernadette, who of course is another major character, who's the other grad student, I guess, on this project. And I think it's important to note that this movie is about myth, but it's also about what those kind of myths mean and how myths, because her whole research paper is this idea about myths and urban legends and how they affect the real world and real ideas, which is a really strange experience to be part of as a movie, because the movie itself is a myth, it is an experience, and it's a way to adapt the world. And through a lot of it, and especially the beginning, you see that her arguments basically that they use Candyman. Candyman isn't real. They use Candyman as a way to justify the horrors of poverty, torture, police brutality, and a lot of the things that come along with the ways in which rich, wealthy people, specifically and typically white people, prey upon the poor working class and typically Black working class.
Yeah, it's also a movie about the urban landscape. It's about living in the city. It's about city life as it is for poor people and Black people. Typically a horror movie might be like on a campground, if you're talking like Friday the 13th, or like a suburban neighborhood, which, I love those settings. They're great. But I like this one too because it kind of is a deviation from that a little bit, where it just kind of focuses on like apartment buildings and projects, which are great. Those areas look great where they're filming in it looks like they're really out there too, so it's great. And yeah, it's just like kind of a movie about kind of what has and hasn't changed like 100 or 200 years ago, I guess you might say. It's very interesting, but I guess we'll talk more about that.
I also think it's interesting that, especially going to the see the second one, or I don't know, I don't really know how to describe it. Sequel, I guess. One of the major points of the original is that it is from an outsider, is from middle class, wealthy-ish white grad student. And her partner Bernadette, who although is Black, is also middle class, going to areas that are impoverished and mostly minorities, and kind of it's from the perspective of Helen. It's from the perspective of, much like I would argue a lot of the viewers who were seeing the film back in 1992, right? It's a lot of people who weren't of that class. It's people kind of looking in. It's exploring the world of kind of, it's watching someone watch someone kind of, right? Because we're kind of not part of this world. And I think there's a certain terror in that itself, is that, and perhaps the terror of Helen is that she becomes part of a world that at the beginning she kind of just watches, right? She has her camera and she's constantly taking pictures, which is just like, I suppose it's one of the things that's always sort of conflicted me about documentaries, because a lot of documentaries profit off the wealth of other people's pain, whether they be impoverished or whether they be, I don't know, in some sort of circumstance that they're in pain, right? You're making a documentary, you're going in, you're filming those people, and then you're going off and then you're making money off it, which is always kind of feels sort of, I don't know, I've always felt sort of weird about the whole experience, because you are using their pain for your advantage. It reminds me a lot of, I'm reading right now for our next project, I just read this book called Patient HM. And basically the idea of Patient HM is he's this guy who doesn't have any memory. Like he lost all short-term memory after like the year 52 or something. And so for the next like 40 years, MIT did like millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of research on this guy, just like tons of research, made billions and billions of dollars off the research that they did on this guy. And this guy never saw a penny of it. And it's just, I think in this way, that's what this film is also about. It's about this exoticizing. It's about this preying on other people's lives so you can, go back home and write a paper on it. I don't know. It's a strange experience as a viewer, because you're not really sure like which side you're on,
But to kind of talk a little bit more about that, Helen though is completely relatable, and she's like, her intents are very clear, and she's not like evil. She's totally fine. she's in people, and she's also great. So like I see what you mean, but then on the other side of it, I think like that character played kind of creates some amount of relatability because she's a very nice person. She's a very she's trying to just understand people. Obviously, you're right. Like obviously, like when you're writing a thesis, you're hoping that it gets picked up so you can make some money off of it. So yeah, there is like kind of like an exploitation element to it. But I didn't think that Helen was like horrible, like a horrible person or an exploitative person, but that is like kind of an aspect of it that is interesting. But yeah, just to talk a little bit about Helen, I think that's a pretty good character. Obviously the perspective of her is questionable, and like you said, they kind of changed that a little bit in the next movie, which is nice, but I think she's a good character. I think she's like really good and interesting, and she goes through a lot in the movie, and like, so yeah, just to say, like, they find out that the Cabrini Green housing project, tons of people have been killed there by Candyman, including Ruthie Jean. And I think before they go to the Cabrini Green, Helen and Bernadette, they're having a few drinks in the apartment building, and Helen's like, hey, check this shit out. Like, the apartment building I live in right now used to be like a housing project, which, yeah, is kind of like a metaphor kind of thing. She's like, they like, painted over the walls and stuff. And look here in the bathroom, if you can see the apartment over the other side. I'm guessing that's like, they did that to save money, I guess. If you move the bathroom mirror, you can move the other one and you can see the apartment on the other side. And they say Candyman in the mirror too, specifically Helen does, and nothing happens. And then they go to the scene of Ruthie Jean's murder, so they visit the project on Cabrini Green.
Yeah, Cabrini Green is, I assume that they actually went, I assume Cabrini Green, it may not be the same name, but was a real
no, it's a real place.
Okay. So they shot on location, and there's
they at least shot outside of
outside.
it. I don't know.
Probably not inside.
Yeah.
But it legitimately looks, because it is projects. There's people kind of hanging about doing different things. As they walk up, there's kind of this like group of heckling men.
Yeah, just black men. They're hanging out.
Yeah, just hanging out doing their thing. And they sort of heckle both Helen and Bernadette, because it's very clear that Helen and Bernadette are not from the area. And of course, it immediately looks like they're cops, because they're dressed very, as Helen puts it, conservatively. And so that sort of conservative dress makes them look a bit like cops, which obviously puts everyone on edge, because police officers aren't famous for being great with people in poverty. So they kind of get heckled a bit, and they go upstairs. They're walking around. Inside, it's very like gross and decrepit. There's like a wall and like windows on the other side, and there's a bunch of graffiti on it. And like the most important graffiti, or like the biggest graffiti on it, says, does it say "so sweet"? It says something with "sweet" in it. Something like that. Yeah, so sweet. And of course, Helen's taking like a bunch of pictures. And then there's the very first jump scare, which is as she takes one of the pictures, one of the doors opens, and there's like this big like Rottweiler, and this woman with a Rottweiler, and they like freak out, and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, we didn't know anyone lived here, blah, 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 blah. And they kind of rush off into the abandoned apartment where the woman was murdered.
Where Ruthie Jean was murdered. They discover a room where it's basically like offerings have been left for Candyman. Like there's portraits of him. There's like art all over the walls and stuff. Like it's this big room, and Helen isn't able to like be in there for very long, but it looks great. It looks really cool. Before they leave, they meet the women again, because the woman is like, what are you guys doing? And they talk, and we discover she has a son, and she's like a single mom, and she lives in the projects, and she talks a little bit about like, you're gonna like talk about how like bad we are, poor people, all this stuff, how we kill each other and all this different stuff. And it's kind of funny because I think in the next scene they're at having dinner with everybody.
The dinner scene is like the most, like, speaking as someone who recently just left academia, right? Because I finally graduated from college. And I find the English department, which is basically what they're in. They're like in a philosophy or something like that. And it's of like the different academias, it's the most academic in like the silliest sense. Like it's people like just obsessed with like writing papers and publishing papers. And, it's this very strange, like weird competitiveness that you see in that scene. It's a lot of like very pompous people sitting around talking about how brilliant they are, and that's exactly what the scene is. It's a bunch of people arguing about these myths and legends. And it's kind of, you were talking about earlier, I do find, and I would agree, that Helen is a much more relatable character, because unlike all the other people that are there, including her husband,
Yeah.
she seems to be the only one that legitimately cares about the people she's doing the research on. Like everyone else, like they just care about like publishing papers. But she like legitimately like wants to help these people. Now, how she's going about it, is it the best way? Who knows? But she thinks she's doing the right thing. And while they're there, that is when the older professor, who's just like the worst person in the world, but great performance for like only being in that one.
I would say his Helen's husband is worse, but continue.
Oh, agreed, very much so. But the professor, is like, oh, I actually wrote a paper on Candyman 5 or 10 years ago, and that's when we learn the original story of Candyman.
Yeah, he says that, Candyman was born in the late 1800s, son of a slave, became, a well-known artist, and he was highly sought after to paint portraits of wealthy white people. And then he fell in love and got pregnant the daughter of a wealthy family. And then they cut off his right hand. They smothered him with honeycomb, and the bees like stung him to death. And then they burned his body across the land on which Cabrini Green was built. So like he was killed like where the housing project is. Once again, another pretty clever, I guess, a metaphor or something like that. Kind of the bodies of the lynched slaves of the past, they're everywhere, you know what I mean? And from the ashes of Candyman holds a building where Black people are murdered and, essentially kept away from white society to this day. Nothing has really changed in 100 years. Instead of maybe lynch mobs, it's maybe moving people around and kind of creating, nothing against housing, but the housing projects are obviously completely fucked because of just poverty in general. So it's not a lynch mob, but it's something akin to it. So I thought that was interesting. And then I think, the next scene, she returns to Cabrini Green by herself, which is obviously a bad decision, but
yeah, talking a little more about sort of the housing projects and going back to a scene we talked about earlier where she talks about how the place that she lived was originally a housing project, but the reason that it didn't become a housing project, or the reason that it didn't stay a housing project, was because there was no way to separate that building from like the wealthy buildings. And it's really interesting because like if you look at like especially Chicago, and I think it's important that they chose Chicago because this is true in other big cities, but I think the way they district them, though often you hear like the phrase like the bad side of the railroad tracks, they often district areas by like landmarks. It's a way to like sort of separate the wealthy from the poor, because they don't want to, right? They want them to work for them. They want them to do all the work for them. They just don't want to actually, be near them or see them. And that's why Cabrini Green exists, because it's not near like the big skyscrapers or like the fancy part of Chicago. It's in this like dilapidated area, and it's purposeful.
I've never been around that area, but like how close is Cabrini Green? How close are they to, maybe they're not closer than I think, but like to like a grocery store or like that would be interesting. But I haven't been in that area before. But yeah, you're right. There's obviously a reason why it's built in place where it is. Yeah, I find that very interesting.
And I think it's also interesting to note that when they tell about Candyman, they don't actually show, like it's not like one of those things where like they do like a flashback or like they show like what
I don't really know.
It's just them talking.
But okay, I will say though, they talk, but they play sounds. There's sounds and stuff. They use like audio and stuff, which works really well. It's very well done.
Even going further on your point, I think this is purposeful, not actually showing the Candyman. I mean, partly it's just because like kind of raise the stakes of mystery behind him. But I think the other part is that this is a movie about storytelling. It's not about what you see. It's about what you hear. It's about what you believe. And so the idea of being told the Candyman instead of being shown, which they also do in the new one in a little different way. They use like puppets, but by not actually showing the Candyman, by using, again, myth, right, even in the movie to sort of perpetuate the sort of terror, I think kind of perpetuates the ideas that are kind of going on, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, no, I think that Flash would just like break up too much anyway. Like flashbacks, like they can be used well, but yeah, I think in this case it would have broken up a little bit too much. I think flashbacks can kind of serve as an interruption. Once again, they're doing the horror movie thing where they're building up the villain, the quote unquote villain. So they're like kind of building up like how like, terrifying it is and how scary it is and how, this or that, you know what I mean? So it's pretty effective, including we get the first encounter with Candyman. She goes to the Cabrini Green and she meets like a little boy, and the little boy is like, hey, check that. Actually, that has a flashback where he's going to the boy and they go to like a bathroom, like a disgusting bathroom. And the boy's like, yeah, like the Candyman killed a little boy there. And she's like, what happens? Like, yeah, the mother was at the store and it was like someone with a mental disability, I guess, the boy. And she's like, stay here and, I'll go to the store. And then the boy like cried out and they go in the stall. And it turns out that like his I guess his penis was cut off, which is like, whoa. I think the little boy says like, yeah, better off dead or something like that. And they're like outside the bathroom, and then Helen's like, okay, I'm gonna go inside. Like, you wait out here. I don't know why she went. She's brave, I guess, but she's
Gotta get the pictures.
And they go inside the bathroom stall, and then she is assaulted by a group of men, including a guy who is dressed up and calls himself the Candy. And she punches her in the face. And this part kind of confused me because it's like, what happened? I guess like the little boy got some help, is what happened.
Yeah.
He got time before they were able to really fuck her up. They assume that he is the guy who's committing all the murders. And then I think it's funny too because she's assaulted and then she leaves, and then her friend Bernadette is like, we're in the newspaper, so we're getting like all kinds of different offers and stuff for our thesis and all this shit. And she's like, yeah, all this stuff. And they're able to recover some pictures too, which Helen looks at later. But then I think she actually meets Candyman in the parking garage the first time.
It's kind of been like a couple of weeks since the accident happened. And, she has this conversation with Bernadette. They're talking about, how great it is, how, suddenly now that this horrific thing has happened, they're able to get, everyone wants their thesis. Also kind of showing how the news also, and this is more true in the second one than in this one, but still true in this one, how they sort of, when something becomes horrific or when there's when there's sort of this horror behind it, suddenly everyone cares about it. No one really cared about the thesis before, she's attacked, but suddenly, right now that she's been attacked, it's this amazing thing, which is what the second one's about, because he's an artist and he makes this artwork and no one cares about it, but then someone dies in front of it and suddenly it's this great piece of art. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing.
It's similar concept. So she's walking to her car and she hears this really deep, creepy voice. And she turns around and standing in front of her is the real Candyman.
He kind of hypnotizes her and he's upset. By the way, played by the great Tony Todd. Very good actor. Does he play Candyman in the new one?
I don't think so.
Really? Tony Todd is old now. I've seen recent footage of him. I mean, he's older, much older now than he was in 1992. He's 30 years older. So I was wondering if they would use him again. But he's so good. He has a great voice. He's very tall, just a very imposing guy. Very, very good.
No, I guess he is.
Really? Oh, wow.
He plays Candyman. I think he plays someone else. He plays I don't know if he plays Candyman. Or, it's hard to tell because in the second one, they don't really ever show his face.
Why?
I don't know. Most of the time, it's covered with bees and stuff. So you can't see his face.
Well, Tony Todd's really good in it. And he tells her, I love when Candyman talks. He has really good writing. His lines are really good. He always says really great lines. And he basically explains in a much more eloquent way that she has kind of discredited his legend. You know what I mean? And he must now kill to continue to perpetuate himself. So at this point forward, the rest of the movie was very hard for me to watch. There's something about the rest of the movie up until the ending part where it's really whoa, okay, I didn't expect this. It's really hard to watch. I don't know if they do something like this in the new movie. No spoilers, but do they do something like this where an innocent person gets accused of something? Because I find that very hard to watch.
Yeah, so it's really interesting about, and I would say the big difference, and perhaps something that I don't know if I necessarily agree with between the first one and the second one, is the first one until the very end, and even you could argue at the end, you're never really sure if Candyman is real or not. You don't know if Helen is murdering people and she's just right. But in the second one, it's very clear that Candyman is real, is a real thing. And then the other thing is that while in the first one, you could say that a lot of people who are killed are innocent. In the second one, everyone who is killed, while isn't necessarily, a murderer, they're all racist people, which is, I think, a really strange turn for Candyman, because like right in the first one, the people that she kills or kidnaps, most of them are just like, you know, innocent people who didn't really do anything. But in the second one, they're all like, all the people who are killed are terrible people. And at the end of the second Candyman, not to spoil anything, he becomes a sort of hero, which is weird when like watching these two back to back, because it's a very different perspective, I guess, on who Candyman is.
Yeah, in the first movie, I wouldn't say that Candyman's a hero. He's a lost soul. So it's like we're sympathetic to his tortures, but he has to stop, you know? So that's interesting, I guess. But like, yeah, like he's like, okay, now I gotta kill a bunch of people. So Helen blacks out and she wakes up, and it's like, this seems crazy. She wakes up in Anne Marie's apartment, who's the person with the dog and the kid, and she's like covered in blood. And she's really good when she like wakes up. She's like, you know, she's like touching herself and stuff, like seeing if she's like got stabbed or something, and she's like totally fine. And like her pet Rottweiler has been decapitated, and the boy has been stolen. And then they attack each other because she's like, you're the only person in the apartment, Helen. Like what happened to my son? You killed my dog. And then the police come out of nowhere and they arrest Helen while Helen's defending herself. So she has like a knife, like while the police are coming in. She goes to jail, and they like, you know, there's that great scene where she's like covered in blood and she has to like, you know, take off all her clothes, and they, you know, she has to like take a shower, and she's crying. She's very good. She's very, very good. And she's bailed out of jail. And then she's like in her apartment and she's like distraught, you know, and she's like, what are we going to do? Like, I don't even know where to begin. You know, as she's leaving too, she's leaving the jail. Like there's tons of like reporters and stuff, and they cover her and they leave. And yeah, she's like totally distraught and she has no idea what she's going to do. Then she's now in their apartment and she's looking at her photographs.
Is this when she's alone?
Yeah, she's alone. She's looking at her photos.
She's looking at the photos, and that is her second meeting.
Yeah, she like sees it in the mirror of like one of the pictures she took.
And so she's looking through it, and you know, she's freaking out now that Candyman's here. He's gonna kill her. And there's a knock at the door. It's Bernadette, and she's like, "Don't come in, right here. Just leave, leave." And Bernadette's like, "What are you talking about? I'm gonna come in." She's like, "No." She's freaking out again, like you said. Incredible performance. Terrified.
Yeah, Candyman like cuts her neck and she's like immobile, you know?
She like can't move. She's freaking out. And then Bernadette walks in, and that's kind of where that scene ends, right?
Bernadette walks in, she's killed by Candyman. And of course, once again, Helen is framed for the crime for killing her best friend. And she is institutionalized into a psychiatric hospital. She's like sedated, and there's a scene where she's like strapped in, and like Candyman, which looks great. Candyman like floats
down.
And of course, you know, Candyman's lines, they're great, but I don't really remember what he says. You know what I mean? Because like it's like you probably have to hear it again. But yeah, he's just mainly like, I had to do what I had to do. You know what I mean? Like I'm, you know, I think the idea is that like too at this point is like Candyman loves Helen because of course he fell in love with probably someone who looks kind of like Helen originally, and he loves Helen, and he almost kind of is almost like begging Helen to submit to him, I guess, to die or whatever it is. When she freaks out and stuff. And then I think she's there for a month or something like that, which is crazy. She's there for like a month.
The way you do like the passage of time, which I think is really interesting, is like neither she nor the audience feels like it's been a month. Like it just feels like it's the next day.
It really, yeah, it doesn't feel like a month. They're like, yeah, we've been like drugging you for a month. She's like, oh, okay.
So she's taken to like a psychiatrist or something.
Yeah,
she's
Dr. Burke.
She's strapped into a wheelchair. She's rolled in. They leave. She's having a conversation with Dr. Berg. That's where we learn that it's been like a month, and also further proof, or I don't know if you call it proof, that Candyman doesn't exist. And she's like, no, he does. He's real. He's here. And he's like, no, none of that's real, blah, blah, blah. And of course, Candyman comes.
She says in the mirror, she looks into the mirror, she does it. Yeah. And then Candyman kills the hell out of it. It's like it's so violent, like the way that the guy reacts when he gets stabbed. It's like, oh, it's great. Great kills in the movie. And she's like, oh, whoa. And Candyman's like, okay, go. And he like helps her out and she escapes. She's smart.
I mean, maybe she shouldn't have called Candyman, but who am I to say?
I mean, I guess it's her only way out of that situation. I mean, yeah, I guess, which I guess I am a little confused. Was Candyman going to come anyway? It seems like he can do whatever he wants.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know what, like, I guess I don't know what summoning means. You know what I mean? Like when you do the mirror thing, what does that do?
I guess like it's like a phone call. So like you're calling to him, like he's doing his, I don't know, Candyman thing, and then you're like just like, hey, come over here. He's like, oh, okay.
That's fair.
I mean that's kind of how it is in the second one.
I guess it has been a month, so he's probably doing other things.
His
Well,
murdering. I don't know.
so yeah, I think you're probably right. It's like a phone call. And she returns to her apartment and she's like, well, this is unusual. She finds Stacy, a student of her husband, painting the room and like everything's covered up. And yeah, it turns out it's established earlier on that he's having an affair with this person. And in fact, earlier in the movie, she tries to call the apartment late at night after she's first arrested and he doesn't answer because he's not there. And then later in the movie, he's like, oh, I was there, I was asleep. And then now it's come full circle where he has essentially restarted his life with his student Stacy. And yeah, Helen confronts him where she's like just really, really angry at him. Just like, oh wow, okay. Yeah, some guy you are. I think that scene ends where she just leaves. And then I think they call the cops or someone or something. It calls a hospital. And they're like all freaked out and stuff. Like Stacy's like, ah. It's a pretty great scene because you're like, yeah, Helen, stick it to him. He sucks. And then she goes to Cabrini Green again.
Does she go to Cabrini Green or does she go to the church?
The church?
I don't know if it's a church, but where the baby is.
That's in the apartment.
Okay. Yes. So she goes back to Cabrini Green because Candyman had told her earlier that baby isn't dead and here's where it is. And if you sacrifice yourself, or if you give yourself to me, Candyman, then I'll let the baby live. So she's like, well, fuck. I don't have anything else to do, I guess. So she goes back to Cabrini Green. She goes to the apartment, I guess, and we see Candyman is sleeping. I think he's like sleeping or something. And she goes up to him. And of course, he wakes up. They have a bit of a scuffle. And then
she gives herself up to him. She like rips off like his shirt or coat, and like his like ribs are like exposed, like his like bones and stuff are like kind of like almost covered in muscles and stuff. Like, and he's got bees inside of him as well, and he's got bees all over his face and in his mouth, which is crazy. I believe Tony Todd did say that like he was stung up a little bit from it, but I think in the interview. There's a great documentary I recommend called Horror Noir, which is a documentary about Black people in horror movies, in American horror movies. Really nice little documentary where they just interview Black filmmakers, actors, directors, old and new. Really great documentary. And yeah, Tony Todd, I think, talks a little bit about that, where he's just like, yeah, like that's how it was. I did it. And I did get stung up a little bit. It's crazy. Like they're all up in his mouth. Like, how do you not have them fly into your throat?
I don't know.
That'd be horrible. But yeah, like he did it, and it's just unbelievable. It just shows his dedication as an actor. Which even Helen, she's covered in bees too. Like they're flying all over. They're not in her mouth, but yeah, and he kisses her, and I guess she kind of I don't know what happens, but he disappears with the baby, and she finds like a mural of Candyman, right? And the woman he fell in love with, and it looks like her. So it's like, it's like, oh, okay. Candyman likes her because she looks kind of like the person he loved when he died. I think at that point, Candyman's like, okay, I'll release the baby, even though she already did the things she was supposed to do. But you have to strike fear you have to like make Cabrini Green's residents afraid. So what happens is I think she hears a baby crying and it's like in a big bonfire pile, right? That was established early on.
It's like all of this like junk. I mean, it's like, it's probably like 3-4 stories high of just like wood and nails and just like garbage. And she hears baby crying. And so she like climbs up this garbage and into, because it's assumed that the baby's inside. And so she climbs into it. And as she's climbing into it, the boy we met earlier doesn't see her climb in, but he sees the hook that she's holding. So it is assumed that the Candyman is in there. So him and everyone else at Cabrini Green douse the whole place in gasoline and set the stockpile aflame.
And she's like in there with the baby and the Candyman. It was almost like Candyman's playing, like he's in there and they're like kind of fighting a little bit. But I think she it's like a stick that's on fire and like stabs it into him. And she tries to like crawl out of the pile and stuff. And wood that's on fire is falling on top of her and she's on fire. She's desperately trying to call a claw out. She's trying to protect the baby. and she claws her way out, and she's on fire and stuff, and like burns all of her hair off, and she's totally burned, and the baby is saved. And then Candyman in the fire is also destroyed. I will say, like, the thing about Candyman is that, like, I don't understand like what his power levels are, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know like what he can and can't do, you know what I mean? Like, I would say that, like, it doesn't make the most sense to me for like a movie monster, but it is a very good movie monster. It's because Tony Todd is like really, really good at just like showing kind of like almost this like forlorn kind of feeling to the character of Candyman, but he's also really scary and violent, and it's just a really great performance, even though like I'm not like totally sure like what he can and can't do. I guess he can fly and appear and make other people appear and disappear, but I guess he can just be killed by fires or something like that. And is he invincible? It seemed like he was pretty invincible, but I guess he wasn't. Once again, it could be in Helen's head, but then again, he killed all these people, you know what I mean? Like I don't know if Helen could do something, I don't know, but that's just my problem with it. That's my only problem with the monster itself. And then she dies.
They realize that she was in there, and they're like, "Oh, the baby's alive," which is good. I'm glad they didn't kill the baby, because the movie was already pretty dark. So I'm glad they didn't murder that baby. Helen dies, and I believe that's when we cut to our final scene, which is her husband and still Stacy, right? Yeah, they're still together for some reason.
But they have the funeral first.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they bury Helen, and Stacy and her husband are there, played by Xander Berkeley. He's good. I checked it on his thing, and he's been in a lot of movies. He's cool. I like him. He's a good actor. They're there because she's being buried, and then like the whole housing project, I guess you might say, comes and pays their respect and dropping in the hook of Candyman, which I think the movie just should have ended there. They drop the Candyman hook in, they lower her down, and that's it. That's the movie. But then, like you said, like you were about to explain, they have the final scene.
I don't know. I kind of feel like, I think it definitely would still work if it ended after the funeral, but I think there's something, to me at least, that kind of puts the final nail in the coffin. And well, here, let me talk about the final scene, and then I'll talk about why I think the scene's important. In the final scene, Stacy's, she's not a great person, but she's doing what she can. So, she's trying to console her, husband who lost Helen, and she's making food, she's doing everything you can, and he goes into the bathroom. He's like traumatized, and he says her name. He says it 5 times: Helen, Helen, Helen.
I will say it's funny when Stacy's in the kitchen, she's like frustrated, she's mad, and she's like throwing like food around because she's like trying to cook dinner. That part's funny to me. I don't know, she's like she's like, fuck this. But yeah, he's like, he has regrets because he misses Helen,
because he's a really shitty person. So he says Helen 5 times, and Helen shows up as this Candyman, like he's brutally murdered. And one of the final shots, of course, is Stacy holding a knife, suggesting perhaps that, and obviously she's going to be accused of murdering him.
And then you have the very last shot, which is kind of the church-like area in the apartment, which is like Candyman's lair. And now there's a new mural of Helen. Her hair's on fire, and they zoom in on it, and that's kind of like during the credits to kind of show that like now she belongs to the local folklore of she's kind of like there. It's kind of weird to say because it is a little like there's something behind it, almost like kind of like the white woman was able to save the day, she was able to save us or something like that. But that's the movie.
The reason I think that scene with Helen is important is because this film is about myths and legends, and the whole film, and I would argue, and perhaps we disagree on this, I don't think Candyman, at least in the first film, the second film, a very different arguments taken. I would argue that Candyman doesn't exist. The Candyman is just an idea people use to justify the terrors and horrors of the world, and Helen was kind of sucked into this sort of world that she couldn't get out of. And I think that's okay that, at least in this film, not so much in the second one, all of the murders that happen could have been Helen. Like she could have done all of those things. There's none of those things happen where like it was impossible. So like Candyman, even though his powers are kind of, it's unclear what they are, I think they're not great enough that she's doing like these supernatural things, which happens like in the next one, the things that happen, it's like, it's very clear that Candyman's a very real monster being thing. And so the scene with Helen, I think, is important at the end, is because it's saying that no matter what you do, you can't kill a myth, you can't kill a legend.
Yeah, yeah.
It just regurgitates in a different form. And that's kind of how it is at the end, right? Candyman becomes Helen and so on and so forth.
I think that's a pretty good reading of it. You could even say though it at the end is kind of like a message on gentrification. You know what I mean? It's like, you had Candyman, who's a black guy who is, kind of like a part of the history of the United States. And then you have like the white savior character. And, all this stuff is like, I'm not saying that any of this stuff is bad or good, just saying, but, you could have, and then Helen is like replaced and her face is everywhere. She's the savior, which she is in the general folklore of the region. She saved the baby, she was brave, she did her thing. But there is kind of like, I would say that there's kind of maybe like a gentrification kind of thing to it. It's kind of hard to read, like final part of the movie, like for me, the final very last scene, that part, it feels a little tacked on. And it feels a little bit like just, difficult to read, which is fine. I'm just like, not like, it's just not my favorite part of the movie. I just find it kind of like, we got to have the fucking, thing and this, we got to have the thing. You have to have the scene at the end where she gets her revenge. I just think it's unnecessary and it feels like kind of like a studio inclusion, but it's definitely like, you definitely could read it it's still an interesting scene because you could read it many different ways and it's not bad. It's just not my favorite ending ever, but it's still good.
Overall, what would you rate this film, Andrew?
I would definitely give it an 8 out of 10. It's very good. Like I said at the beginning of the film, I really like just how using kind of like the city of Chicago, it looks fantastic. Just the overhead shots are amazing. A lot of overhead shots we forgot to mention. Lots of overhead shots of people walking, of cars, of just really, really well done. I love, like I said, the Philip Glass screenplay. Not screenplay, the music. It really kind of chugs along the movie in a way. And yeah, I think Candyman's a great villain. I think all the performances are really, really good. And I think all the themes in it are really interesting and very provocative, and they still, apply today. Race, like we talked about, social class, city life, urban life. Really, really well done, well directed, very well directed movie. I honestly don't have any problems with like kind of like the direction of the movie. Just maybe like some, elements here and there, but with like the story and stuff. But, I was very, very impressed. And it's definitely probably like one of the best like 90s horror movies I've ever seen. It's very well done. I'm a fan of Scream. I'm trying to think of like another 90s horror movie. I guess like some Cronenberg movies that were made in the 90s that are really good, but especially for a slasher movie, very good. 90s slasher movie, very, very good.
Yeah, I think I'm of the similar mind. I'm also going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. I thought it was a really enjoyable experience. I think it's a movie that has a lot to say, which, I mean, it's not that every movie has to have something to say, but I think if you are going to have something to say, there's a lot more pressure to do it well. And I think the fact that it is simultaneously enjoyable and still has something to say really is a credit to the film. And the fact that, a film with so many negative things to say about American culture can be this famous, I think is a big deal. And the fact that they can remake it and, the film can do really well. And I think after having, seen both Candyman, I think I have more respect for the original now that, because even though like the new one, they have great CGI and great effects, and it's definitely scarier than the original.
Did they use real bees?
No.
Can you tell?
The scene, okay, so they repeat the scene where like the ants eat the bee. That scene you can tell that they aren't real. But when there's like a bunch of them and they're like buzzing around, you can't really tell. I get why they didn't use real bees, because, I would not use real bees, and all the more to Tony Todd for putting all those bees in his mouth, because I would never, to be such a great actor that you're willing to put dozens or hundreds of bees in your mouth is just absolutely terrifying. But, having that all be said, I do think that the original is better than the remake for a lot of good reasons, even if perhaps maybe Nia DaCosta, the director of the new one, has more visual finesse than the original. That might also just be a budget thing. I think the second one just had a much larger budget than the original. But overall, I mean, a real good film.
I like it. I don't know if it's like a too like horror slasher movie for me. I don't think it's going to be that, but very good.
All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. I'm Austinlugo. You can find me at Austinlugo12.
I'm Andrew Harp. You can find me at ADHarp24 on Twitter.
You can find this podcast anywhere you listen to your podcast. You can also find us on YouTube or Instagram at With Nothing to Say Podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for listening, guys.
Thanks, guys.